to his chosen people, inscribing them in a book, preserving the written texts forever. That's what archivists work at. Isaiah refers to something that actually happened, and we still have it because we have it in the Bible. Now, if an engineer reads the Bible, he will notice and give attention to buildings and roads. If a physician reads the Bible, he will notice and pay attention to diseases and cures. And if a farmer reads it, he will notice crops, animals, planting and harvest. Often people with different backgrounds will find interesting insights and information in the Bible verses. Now, I'm not a farmer, so I don't notice harvesting and planting. I'm not an engineer, so I don't really notice things about buildings and so forth. And I'm not a physician, so diseases and so forth. But I'm a librarian, and so passages that have special interest to me are verses about writing and books and archives. And I'd like to, with this short message, give you some attention to some of those verses. I find it inspiring to know from Isaiah 30 verse 8, from earliest times, the prophets stressed the importance of writing down what God was saying. What God was saying to his people, saving the record and making it known as a witness forever. The record keeping of God's acts and activities and his people is so strongly emphasized in Isaiah that is given as a divine command. This should empower us and for us to remember and place the same emphasis on recording and preserving God's witness to us. I want to highlight several other Bible passages that have caught my attention as a librarian and archivist. The second passage for an archivist like me is to note one of those verses most of us would read and pass over without noticing any importance. And this verse is important for knowing about Old Testament literacy. The verse is about Gideon as he and a group of supporters approached the city of Succoth. It is from Judges 8:14. And it reads this: Gideon caught a young man, one of the people of Succoth, and questioned the young man, and the young man listed for Gideon the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 names. Now, the young man listed for Gideon, in the Hebrew, the list means he wrote down. The interesting feature for me is, what was a young man doing out in the countryside? Well, he was probably a farmer, or most likely a herdsman, and yet he can write 77 names down. What does it tell us about the importance in the time of the judges that the ordinary people, the herdsmen, can read and write? It means that the Hebrew people would invest enough energy and time and energy to read and write so that they can read and write what God has written for them, written down. Now, in our own Mennonite history, one of the important and curious times was at the Reformation, when the people could read the Bible in their own language. The first printing of the Bible in German, actually it was in Low German, was about 1480, about 40 years before Martin Luther got around to put it out in High German. And so in Low German, the Dutch people, the people in North Germany could easily read the Bible. And when they read the Bible, they were surprised at what was there. Now, they had been instructed in church of church law, church doctrine, and so forth from the priests. But now they were able to read exactly what God had written for them. Menno Simons writes that he was a priest for several years before he actually read the Bible. How is it that a priest can become a priest without reading the Bible? Well, he learned church law, church doctrine, commentaries, and so forth that were written about the Bible, but actually reading it, that was something different. In this passage, Isaiah has another verse that's interesting to me as someone who's interested in books and libraries and archives. I turn to Isaiah 8, chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, and this is what it's written. Then the Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write on it in common characters belonging to Mount Baz, and have it attested for me by reliable witnesses. Now, I'm not a Bible scholar, but I read the Bible, and I had to look up what Baz means, and it means it's a ceremonial name for Isaiah's son. So what Isaiah's written is, as the Lord says, write something in common characters that your son can easily read. Now, you would pass over that, but the question that I face on it is, if there's common characters, are there uncommon characters in Isaiah's time? Now, what would that be? Well, just move on a little bit. In the time of Christ, they were in Palestine, in Israel, and who was controlling the area? Well, the Roman Empire was controlling it. And what was the language of the Roman Empire? It was Latin. Right? So if you're going to write in common characters, you won't write in Latin. Those are the uncommon characters. Right? And in Isaiah's time, they were in a similar situation. There was their own language, the Hebrew language, but there was the uncommon characters, and that was the Akkadian language. And so when archivists dig up dig up clay tablets and things like this, they're not written in Hebrew, they're written in Akkadian languages, because that was the uncommon language that the diplomats, the scholars used, but not the ordinary common people. And Isaiah has been told, write in the language that the ordinary common people can read. We shall not, I'm going to go back and Isaiah was writing in this writing in common characters in a troubled time, and the message from God needed to be recorded so that everyone can read it. Now, I'm going to move on to a fourth passage, and that's in 2 Kings 22, 8 to 10. It's about a time of the restoration of Judah after a period in which the kings were not listening to God, and there was a lot of pagan worship in the area. And the work of the time of 2 Kings 22 was a time when the temple was being restored and people were trying to get back into a right relationship with God. And this is 2 Kings 22, 8 to 10. One day Hilkiah the high priest went to Shaphan the secretary and exclaimed, I have discovered a scroll in the temple with God's laws written on it. He gave the scroll to Shaphan to read. Then Shaphan reported to the king about the progress of the repairs in the temple. He also mentioned the scroll found by Hilkiah. Shaphan read it to the king. Then the king heard what was written in it. He tore his clothes in terror. He commanded Hilkiah the priest and Shaphan and Asaiah, the king's assistant, and Achab, Shaphan's son, and Achbor, Micaiah's son, to ask the Lord, what shall we do? For we have not been following instructions in this book. You must be very angry with us, for neither we nor our ancestors have followed these commands. Now, It's very clear in Kings that the high priest experienced great joy in discovering this scroll. Then the king had considerable anxiety because it's quite different from what they've been doing. And he could change and now follow God's laws. Recovering the scroll and carefully reading God's message on it would enable the Hebrew nation to get into the right relationship with God. Peace, love, righteousness will result from this recorded scroll as they read it to the people. I'd just like to finish my short little meditation with a verse of warning. And that message is to archives and others, and it is found in 1 Kings 11:41. And it reads this way. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, as well as his wisdom, are they not recorded in the book of the Acts of Solomon? Well, are they? Where is the book? Has anyone read it? Today we don't know. The book has disappeared. It's either been lost or destroyed or just forgotten many centuries ago. Perhaps it didn't get into the temple archives, or maybe it wasn't properly cared for there. There are about half a dozen books mentioned in the Old Testament that scholars today know nothing about. Somehow some materials from the motto of the archivists given in the first verse became a failure. This verse in 1 Kings 11:41 is to remind us and encourage us archivists, to do a better job, to preserve the records. For God's purpose and witness continues to this day and should be recorded and remembered and read. Thank you.
Could we stand, please, and sing When We Walk with the Lord?
Do Joshua chapter 4, verses 4 to 7. Joshua called out the 12 men whom he selected from the people of Israel, one man from each tribe. Joshua directed them, "Come to the middle of the Jordan and take your place in front of the crest of God, the chest of God, your God. Each of you heft a stone to your shoulder, a stone for each of the tribes of the people of Israel. So you'll have something later to mark the occasion. When your children ask you, 'What are these stones for?' you will say, 'The flow of the Jordan was stopped in front of the chest of the covenant of God as it crossed the Jordan, stopped in its tracks. These stones are a permanent memorial for the people of Israel.'"
For me, the story of Drake, Saskatchewan and its people is as exciting as any story I know. First, let's look at its name. I'm wondering if any of you know who this is. You said Francis Drake? Right on. Drake got its name from Sir Francis Drake, an Englishman who lived from 1540 to 1596. His seamen, meaning the people who were on his ship when he sailed around the world, are Gilbert, Howard, Norreys, and Chaldees. And your streets here are named after these four people. Drake was one of the first people who sailed around the world, but, and very sadly, he was one of the first Englishmen who participated in the slave trade. He would kidnap Africans and take them to the Spanish colonies. He became rich. But back to this place. The CPR Railway had built in 1890 the railway from Saskatoon all the way to Winnipeg, which allowed Johann Gerbrand from Kansas and other Mennonites from Oklahoma to get off at Lanigan, and after they had taken the horses and wagons out of the boxcars, they drove down to an area close to this, maybe 4 miles away from here, and they started farms. By 1907, another line, thank goodness, came from near Lanigan past Drake. By 1906, Drake had its first barn, and it was called the Gerbrand Barn. And by 1907, the first church was built just about 6 kilometers from here. And John Gerbrand also became the first postmaster. The 1920s saw a lot of Russian Mennonites called Ruslander, and they moved into this area. Drake was booming in the 1920s. Can you imagine that by that time a band existed called the North Star Mennonite Church Brass Band? The photograph that you have seen are of about 18 people playing trumpets, tubas, slide trombones, French horns, and more. It was a fine witness in the early times, and North Star Mennonite Church was instrumental in starting several other places of worship in the community. But now to the Old Testament and Joshua. God and Joshua are negotiating a deal. It's sort of, the Israelites have not yet crossed the Jordan River. As they wait, God plays a game with them. I call it future perfect giving of thanks. So as they wait, God says to Joshua, you have to promise me now to say thank you for something that hasn't happened yet. That's not very normal. First you get something and then but God said, no. We're going to start thanking ahead of my act of kindness to you. A bit weird, but I think I've done it too. When my daughters were very young and were about to get a bicycle that they would share, I said, okay, when I give you the bike, what will you do? They said, we'll say thanks. I did exactly the same thing. I hadn't yet given them the bicycle, but I had said, what are you going to do when you get it? We'll say thanks. I shouldn't have done it, but I did. But God is so excited that God can't help doing the same thing. Now to chapter 4. The Israelites are now safely in the promised land, and God says, okay, you're in the promised land. What are you going to do to remember me? Always God was saying, what will you do so that I will be remembered? Build me, God says, a cairn. Collect 12 great big rocks. Pile them up. Mortar them lightly. And then when people come by, they will say, once upon a time we were in the desert for 40 years, and then God rescued you, and these stones are here to remind you of what I have done. So, what do the North Star people do to remember what God did for them? Well, we write up the stories and archive them at MHSS, the Mennonite Historical Society. Victor has talked about this. Stories are important.